The banging on my front door started at exactly 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, each knock landing with the aggressive rhythm of someone who'd confused my home with a punching bag. I was 3 sips into my first coffee, still wearing the same oil-stained work pants from yesterday's emergency water main inspection, when I heard that sound that every homeowner dreads, the unmistakable cadence of an angry neighbor who's convinced they've got the moral high ground. Through my kitchen window, I could see her. Carol Henderson, though everyone in Riverside Meadows called her by a different name behind closed doors. She stood on my porch like a general surveying enemy territory, her blonde highlights catching the early morning sun, one manicured hand planted firmly on her hip while the other continued its assault on my door. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, paired with those designer jeans that suburban women wear to prove they're both sophisticated and approachable. The effect was neither. I opened the door mid-knock, and her fist froze in the air like a cartoon character running off a cliff. "Can I help you, Carol?" Her eyes were already scanning past me, probably cataloging violations she could report to the HOA she'd run like her personal fiefdom for the past 6 years. But this morning, her attention was locked on something else entirely, my truck, sitting exactly where I'd parked it last night in my own driveway, minding its own business like it had every right to be there. Because it did. "Mr. Patterson," she said, and the way she emphasized the Mr. made it sound like an insult. "We need to discuss your vehicle situation immediately." The truck in question was a 2019 Ford F450 Super Duty, white with amber warning lights mounted on the roof rack, equipped with a hydraulic liftgate and enough tool storage to handle just about any infrastructure emergency the city could throw at me. It was big, it was loud when the diesel engine turned over, and it was currently the source of Carol Henderson's barely contained fury. "My vehicle situation," I repeated, taking another sip of coffee. The morning air still had that crisp bite that Iowa autumns are famous for, and somewhere down the street, I could hear the Ramirez kids arguing about who got to ride in the front seat on the way to school. Normal suburban sounds. The kind of peaceful morning Carol was about to absolutely destroy. That monstrosity, she gestured at my truck like it had personally insulted her bloodline, has been parked in your driveway for 3 weeks now. And frankly, David, it's becoming a serious problem for property values in this community. I'd lived in Riverside Meadows for exactly 14 months, and in that time, I'd learned that Carol measured the entire universe by its impact on property value. A kid's basketball hoop left out past sunset? Property values. Halloween decorations still up in November? Property values. The Johnsons painting their shutters navy instead of the HOA-approved colonial blue? You better believe that was a property values crisis. "Carol, that truck is parked on my private property in my driveway, causing exactly 0 problems for anyone." "It's an eyesore," she shot back, her voice rising with that particular pitch that suggested she'd been rehearsing this confrontation in her bathroom mirror. "It's commercial equipment, which violates our community standards regarding non-residential vehicles. And the noise when you start it up at ungodly hours is disturbing the peace of this entire neighborhood." Ungodly hours. I'd started that truck at 5:30 a.m. exactly once in 3 weeks, when the city's main water treatment facility had an emergency valve failure that threatened to leave 12,000 residents without water. But Carol wouldn't know about that, because Carol's understanding of how her comfortable suburban life actually functioned began and ended with whatever made her personal kingdom look prettier. "The HOA covenants are very clear about this," she continued, pulling out her phone with the practiced flourish of someone who'd weaponized documentation. "Section 7, subsection 3, paragraph B states that all vehicles parked in resident driveways must be passenger vehicles or light trucks. Your vehicle clearly exceeds the weight classification for light trucks, and the commercial signage makes it inappropriate for a residential setting. I had to give her credit. She'd done her homework, or at least she thought she had. What Carol didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, because she'd never bothered to look past her own narrow definitions of appropriate and inappropriate, was that the truck she was so desperate to eliminate wasn't just any commercial vehicle. "Carol," I said, setting my coffee mug down on the porch railing, "I appreciate your concern about community standards, but that truck isn't going anywhere." Her face went through about 15 emotions in 3 seconds, finally settling on the particular shade of indignant rage that comes right before someone makes a threat they can't take back. "Then you leave me no choice, David. I'm filing an official HOA violation complaint this morning, and you'll be facing immediate fines of $500, increasing by $200 per day until the vehicle is removed." And if you think I'm bluffing, she leaned in close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixing with the morning air. "You clearly don't know who you're dealing with." The threat hung between us like a challenge, and I watched her stiletto heels click back down my driveway toward her house, 3 doors down, each step landing with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for abusing the minor authority she'd accumulated. What Carol Henderson didn't know, what she was about to discover in the most catastrophic way possible, was that some trucks aren't just trucks. Some vehicles carry protection that goes way beyond registration papers and insurance cards. And the man she'd just threatened with financial ruin had spent 18 years learning exactly how to dismantle people who confused petty power with actual authority. I picked up my coffee mug and looked at the truck sitting peacefully in my driveway, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun, the small municipal seal on the driver's door barely visible from this angle. That seal, that tiny detail Carol had dismissed as commercial signage, was about to become the most expensive oversight of her entire life. My phone buzzed with a text from my supervisor at the city. "Water main inspection on Riverside today. Need the truck by 8. I texted back, "Truck's ready. Might have an interesting story for you later." Because here's what Carol Henderson had failed to understand in her rush to enforce her personal vision of suburban perfection. That truck didn't belong to me. It never had. That Ford F-450, with its hydraulic lift and infrastructure equipment, was city property, assigned to my position as Senior Municipal Infrastructure Manager, protected by governmental immunity that made HOA covenants about as relevant as a kindergarten playground rule. And threatening to fine a city employee for parking city property while performing city duties? That wasn't just stupid. That was the kind of mistake that gets federal attorneys very, very interested in your entire operation. I finished my coffee and headed inside to make some phone calls. Carol thought she was handling a vehicle situation. What she'd actually done was light a fuse on an investigation that would expose 6 years of HOA corruption, bid rigging, and systematic harassment of anyone who didn't bow to her suburban monarchy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I needed to let Carol dig herself just a little bit deeper. Because the thing about people who've never faced consequences for their abuse of power is that they always escalate. And every escalation would become evidence in a case that would dismantle everything she'd built. The morning sun climbed higher over Riverside Meadows, and somewhere 3 doors down, Carol Henderson was probably already typing up her violation complaint, confident she'd won another battle in her endless war for aesthetic perfection. She had no idea the war was already over. She just didn't know it yet. My name is David Patterson. And for the past 18 years, I've been the person who makes sure your toilet flushes, your tap water doesn't kill you, and your street doesn't collapse into a sinkhole during the spring thaw. Senior Municipal Infrastructure Manager for the City of Riverside isn't a job that gets you on magazine covers or invited to cocktail parties, but it's the kind of work that keeps civilization running while everyone else argues about property values and lawn height regulation. I know every water main, every sewer line, every storm drain, and every utility corridor in this city's 147 square miles. I know which streets were built on old creek beds that turn into mud pits when it rains. I know which neighborhoods have lead service lines that need replacing before they poison another generation of kids. I know where the emergency shoot-off valves are located, which contractors actually know what they're doing, and which city council members understand infrastructure versus which ones think it's boring budget line items they can ignore until something catastrophic happens. That truck Carol Henderson wanted gone? That wasn't some vanity project or weekend warrior toy. That was my mobile command center, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, hydraulic tools, emergency repair equipment, and direct radio communication with every utility crew in the county. When a water main breaks at 3 in the morning and 30,000 people are about to lose service, that truck is the difference between a 2-hour fix and a 3-day disaster. But Carol didn't care about any of that because Carol Henderson had spent the last 6 years building a little empire where she got to decide what mattered and what didn't. I moved to Riverside Meadows 14 months ago after my divorce finalized. 23 years of marriage dissolved because Sarah wanted someone who worked normal hours and didn't smell like utility tunnels. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. Infrastructure emergencies don't care about anniversary dinners or your kids' soccer games. After the split, after selling the house we'd raised our daughter in, I needed somewhere quiet to rebuild my life that was still close enough to work that I could respond to emergencies. Riverside Meadows looked perfect on paper. A planned community of 300 homes built in 2015, tucked into a corner of the city that had been farmland until developers discovered they could turn cornfields into quarter-acre lots, selling for $400,000 each. The houses were decent quality, built by Morrison Construction under contract with Riverside Development Group. Standard suburban fare, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, attached 2-car garage, and enough backyard to convince yourself you were living the American dream. What I didn't know when I signed the purchase agreement was that Riverside Meadows came with Carol Henderson, and Carol came with an HOA that functioned less like a community organization and more like an authoritarian regime with very specific opinions about window treatments. The Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association had started out innocent enough, according to Tom Ramirez, my next-door neighbor who'd lived here since the development opened. The original board members were young families who just wanted to make sure people mowed their lawns and didn't paint their houses electric purple. Standard HOA stuff that kept the neighborhood looking presentable without getting crazy about it. Then Carol Henderson moved in 5 years ago, joined the board within 6 months, and staged what Tom called the Great HOA Coup during a board meeting where exactly 11 people showed up. She'd brought printed agendas, Robert's Rules of Order, and enough organizational fury to convince everyone else that she should be president. Within a year, she'd rewritten the covenants to give herself almost unlimited enforcement authority, appointed her friends to every board position, and turned the HOA into her personal instrument of suburban control. The stories started coming out after Carol's first visit to my house, shared in whispered conversations at neighborhood barbecues and sympathetic text messages from people who'd been watching from their windows. Tom Ramirez got hit with $1,600 in fines over 8 months because his teenage son's basketball hoop stayed in the driveway overnight. According to Carol's interpretation of the covenants, recreational equipment had to be stored in garages between sunset and sunrise. When Tom pointed out that the hoop was on wheels and they rolled it in every night, Carol claimed that the oil stain where it sat during the day constituted a permanent installation that required Architectural Review Board approval. Then Carol drove past, decided vegetables were somehow lowering property values, and threatened Margaret with daily fines unless she replaced everything with HOA-approved ornamental flowers. Margaret was 74 years old, living on a teacher's pension, and that garden had been her primary source of fresh produce. The Johnsons, the young black couple who'd moved in 2 years ago with their twin daughters, got targeted so systematically it made my blood boil. Violation notices for parking their work truck in their own driveway overnight, even though half the neighborhood did the same thing. Complaints about their kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Citations for their fence being a quarter-inch too tall, measured with a precision that suggested Carol had shown up with surveying equipment. When Marcus Johnson finally confronted Carol at a board meeting, she told him that certain residents needed to work harder to fit community standards or they might be happier elsewhere. That phrase, happier elsewhere, was Carol's favorite weapon. She wielded it like a club against anyone who pushed back, anyone who questioned her authority, anyone who had the audacity to suggest that maybe an HOA president shouldn't have dictatorial control over what color people painted their mailboxes. But here's what made Carol Henderson particularly dangerous. She wasn't just some bored housewife playing small-time tyrant. Carol's husband, Robert Henderson, owned Henderson Construction Services, the largest residential construction company in the county. And between Carol's HO, a presidency, and Robert's business connections, they'd managed to create a very profitable little ecosystem. Every major project in Riverside Meadows, from roof repairs to fence installations to driveway resurfacing, had to go through the HOA's Architectural Review Board for approval. And somehow, mysteriously, the only contractors who ever got approved without months of bureaucratic delays were companies that Robert Henderson either owned or partnered with. Residents who tried to hire outside contractors found themselves drowning in paperwork, waiting for approvals that never came, getting hit with violation notices for work that wasn't progressing fast enough. It was a beautiful scam, really. Use HOA authority to create artificial barriers, then offer your own companies as the easier solution. Legal enough to avoid criminal charges, corrupt enough to make you a fortune if nobody with the right knowledge ever bothered to look closely at what you were doing. I'd seen this pattern before in my infrastructure work. Contractors who bid rigged municipal projects, developers who paid off planning commissioners, utility companies that overcharged captive customers. The specifics changed, but the underlying corruption was always the same. People with a little bit of power who figured out how to turn it into a lot of money, betting that nobody would ever care enough to stop them. Carol Henderson had been running this operation for 6 years, targeting vulnerable residents who couldn't afford lawyers, who didn't understand their rights, who were too scared or too tired to fight back against an AOA president, with unlimited time and her husband's construction money bapping her up. What Carol didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, because she'd never bothered to learn anything about the quiet guy in the house with the loud truck, was that I'd spent 18 years working inside government systems. I knew how municipal immunity worked. I understood the legal protections that covered city employees performing their duties. I'd sat through hundreds of hours of city council meetings, planning commission hearings, and legal briefings about exactly where government authority started and where private covenant power ended. And more importantly, I knew people. I knew the city attorney who'd been looking for a test case to push back against HOA overreach. I knew the county prosecutor who hated bid rigging schemes. I knew the state attorney general's office investigator who'd been tracking construction corruption across multiple counties. Carol Henderson thought she was dealing with just another resident she could bully into submission. What she'd actually done was pick a fight with someone who had the knowledge, the connections, and the documentation skills to dismantle her entire operation. But I wasn't going to rush this. You don't spend 18 years managing complex infrastructure projects without learning patience. You don't fix a broken water system by slapping a patch on the visible leak. You trace the problem back to its source and fix the underlying failure that caused it. Carol's threat to fine me for the truck was just the visible leak. The underlying failure was 6 years of systematic corruption that had turned an entire neighborhood into her personal profit center while making hundreds of families miserable. So I did what I always do when I spot a problem. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every threat, every violation notice. I pulled property records showing which contractors got HOA approval and traced their ownership back to Henderson Construction Services. I talked to neighbors and collected their stories, their fine notices, their documentation of years of harassment. And I made a phone call to Rachel Torres, the senior city attorney who'd been my friend since we'd worked together on the controversial water treatment plant expansion 3 years ago. Rachel, I need to ask you about something. If an HOA tries to fine a city employee for parking city property while performing city duties, what kind of legal exposure are they looking at? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Rachel started laughing. Not polite laughter. The kind of deep, genuine amusement that comes from watching someone accidentally step on a legal landmine. David, please tell me your HOA president is actually that stupid. Her name's Carol Henderson, and yes, she absolutely is. Then you just became my favorite case study for the next city council meeting about HOA overreach. Let me make some calls. I'm telling you all this because I guarantee at least half of you watching this have a Carol Henderson in your neighborhood right now. Maybe she spells her name differently. Maybe he's a man. Maybe they hide behind phrases like community standards and property values while they systematically make your life miserable for the crime of not bowing to their petty authority. And I want you to understand something important. These people aren't invincible. They're powerful because we let them be powerful. They win because most people don't have the time, the money, or the energy to fight back against someone with unlimited free time and a clipboard full of violations. But every empire has a weakness. Every scam has a paper trail. And every corrupt official eventually makes one mistake big enough that someone with the right knowledge can leverage it into a reckoning. Carol Henderson's mistake was assuming that a loud truck was just a loud truck. What it actually was city property protected by governmental immunity, parked by a city employee who knew exactly how to trace corruption back to its source and document every single violation along the way. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because I want to know how many of you are dealing with your own HOA nightmare right now. And stick around, because Carol's story is about to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. For everyone else anyway. For Carol, it just gets worse. The violation notice arrived in my mailbox exactly 48 hours after Carol's first visit, printed on official Riverside Meadows HOA letterhead with enough legal terminology to intimidate someone who didn't know better. $500 fine for unauthorized commercial vehicle storage, plus $200 per day escalating penalties until the vehicle was removed. Payment due within 14 days, or the HOA would place a lion on my property. A lion. Carol Henderson thought she could put a lion on my house because I'd parked a city truck in my own driveway. I sat at my kitchen table reading this legal fiction while my coffee went cold, and I did what any reasonable person would do. I started making calls to every neighbor who'd ever complained about Carol's reign of terror. What I discovered over the next week made my blood pressure spike and my prosecutor friends practically salivate at the pattern of systematic abuse. Let me tell you about Carol Henderson's kingdom, because understanding how deep this corruption ran is the only way to appreciate how satisfying it was watching it all come crashing down. Teresa Walsh was the first person who agreed to talk on the record. She was a single mother of 2, working double shifts as an ER nurse to keep up with her mortgage after her husband died from cancer 3 years ago. Teresa lived 4 houses down from me, and from the outside, Her home looked like every other house in Riverside Meadows. Neat lawn, trimmed hedges, nothing that would catch your attention as you drove past. But Teresa had a secret that Carol Henderson had discovered and weaponized. She was broke. It started with the garden gnome, Teresa told me over coffee at her kitchen table while her kids were at school. She spoke in that exhausted tone of someone who'd fought too many battles and lost them all. My daughter, Emma, was 6 when her dad died. She loved the stupid ceramic gnome that Mark had bought her at a craft fair. It was holding a little fishing pole, and Mark used to tell her it was fishing for wishes in our garden. Teresa's voice cracked slightly, and she took a moment to compose herself. Emma put it in our front flower bed right after the funeral. It helped her process the grief, having something of her dad's where she could see it every day. 3 weeks after the gnome appeared, Carol showed up with a violation notice. Garden ornaments required Architectural Review Board approval, and ceramic gnomes specifically violated community aesthetic standards because they attracted the wrong element to the neighborhood. When Teresa asked what wrong element meant, Carol's response was apparently unprintable in polite company. Something about how certain decorative choices signaled that a homeowner didn't take pride in maintaining property values, and how homes with those signals tended to attract other residents who also didn't care about community standards. Teresa removed the gnome to avoid the fine. Emma cried for 3 days. But that was just the opening salvo. Over the next 2 years, Carol hit Teresa with violation after violation. The grass was a 1/4 inch too long during a week when Teresa was pulling 70-hour shifts and her lawn service had canceled. $50 fine. Her garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day because she'd forgotten to bring them in after a night shift. $75 fine. Her mailbox post had a chip in the paint that constituted improper maintenance. $100 fine. Each violation was technically within HOA rules, technically defensible, and absolutely calculated to target someone who didn't have the time or money to fight back. Teresa paid every fine because she couldn't risk a lion on her property, couldn't afford a lawyer, and couldn't handle one more thing on top of raising 2 kids alone while working enough hours to keep the bank from foreclosing. She knew exactly what she was doing, Teresa said, staring into her coffee cup. Every violation came right after a major expense. Emma needed braces, and boom, violation notice. My car needed new tires, and suddenly my fence had improper staining. It was like she was watching my bank account and timing the attacks for maximum damage. The kicker came when Teresa tried to refinance her mortgage to get a lower interest rate. The title search revealed that Carol had placed a warning notation on her property for ongoing covenant violations, which tanked the refinancing. Teresa was stuck with her higher payment, drowning in HOA fines, and Carol had made it clear that the violations would continue until Teresa either sold her house or learned to meet community standards. Marcus and Jennifer Johnson had it worse, and the racial component was so blatant it made my stomach turn. Marcus was a software engineer who worked from home. Jennifer taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 miles away. They had twin daughters, Sophia and Maya, who were 7 years old and absolutely full of life. The Johnsons were the first Black family to move into Riverside Meadows, arriving 2 years ago with genuine excitement about joining what the real estate listing had called a vibrant, welcoming community. Carol Henderson welcomed them with a violation notice before they'd finished unpacking. The moving truck had stayed in their driveway overnight because the movers ran late. Carol cited them for commercial vehicle parking between the hours of sunset and sunrise. When Marcus pointed out that half the neighborhood had contractors' trucks parked overnight regularly, Carol informed him that certain residents needed to demonstrate extra commitment to community standards to help everyone feel comfortable. The message was clear: you're Black, so you're starting from a deficit. You need to be better than everyone else just to be considered equal. Over the next 2 years, the Johnsons documented 37 separate violation notices. Marcus kept them all in a 3-ring binder that he showed me with the pride of someone who'd been called crazy for documenting harassment, and finally had proof he was right. Violation for their daughters, drawing hopscotch squares on the sidewalk with washable chalk. Apparently, sidewalk art wasn't explicitly prohibited in the covenants, but Carol decided it violated the spirit of maintaining clean public spaces. When the Johnson twins asked why the white kids 3 houses down could draw with chalk without getting in trouble, Jennifer had to explain racism to 7-year-olds who'd been promised they were moving to a place where everyone was equal. Violation for parking their work vehicles in the driveway. Marcus had a company car with his employer's logo on the door. Jennifer drove a small SUV with a bumper sticker that said "Teachers Change the World." Carol classified both as commercial vehicles that required overnight garage storage. When Marcus provided HOA meeting minutes from 2 years earlier, specifically approving overnight driveway parking for residents' work vehicles, Carol claimed those minutes didn't apply to vehicles with advertising on them. Violation for their fence being installed 3 inches too tall. Marcus had measured it himself before installation, matching it exactly to the covenant's specifications. But after the contractor finished, Carol showed up with a surveying team and declared it violated height restrictions. The contractor swore the measurements were correct. Carol demanded they tear it down and rebuild it at their own expense or face escalating fines. The cost to fix Carol's violation was $4,000. But the incident that made Marcus finally snap happened at the neighborhood 4th of July barbecue. The Riverside Meadows, HOA, hosted an annual Independence Day celebration in the community park, complete with bounce houses, a barbecue competition, and fireworks at dusk. The Johnsons had attended the previous year and had a decent time, so they came back with their daughters excited to see their friends from school. Marcus was manning the grill for the barbecue competition, cooking his grandmother's secret recipe ribs that had won awards at family reunions. People were complimenting the food, and Marcus was actually starting to feel like he belonged in this community. Then Carol appeared, clipboard in hand, with 2 other board members flanking her like security guards. "Marcus, I need you to pack up immediately. We've received multiple complaints about smoke from your grill, affecting other families' enjoyment of the event." Marcus looked around. There were 6 other grills going, all producing the same amount of smoke that barbecue grills produce. "Carol, everyone's grilling. That's kind of the point of a barbecue competition. The complaints were specifically about your grill, Marcus. And as HOA president, I take resident concerns seriously. I'm going to have to ask you to shut down and remove your equipment from the premises." The park went quiet. 60 people watching this exchange, all of them understanding exactly what was happening, but none of them willing to speak up and become Carol's next target. "You're kicking me out of a community event because my barbecue smoke is bothering people, but the 6 white families with grills can stay?" Carol's face hardened. "This isn't about race, Marcus. This is about responding to legitimate community concerns. If you're going to make this difficult, I can have you cited for creating a hostile environment at a family event." Marcus packed up his grill, loaded his daughters into the car while they cried about leaving their friends, and drove home with Jennifer seething in the passenger seat about how they'd just paid $400,000 to live in a neighborhood where they weren't welcome. That night, Marcus filed a complaint with the County Human Rights Commission alleging discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules based on race. Carol's response came within 48 hours, a letter from her attorney threatening to sue Marcus for defamation and demanding he withdraw the complaint or face legal action that would expose him to significant financial liability. Marcus withdrew the complaint because he couldn't afford a legal battle against Carol's husband's construction company money. But he kept that letter, and he kept every violation notice, and he kept meticulous notes about every interaction with Carol Henderson, waiting for the day when someone with power would actually listen. That day was coming faster than Carol realized. Then there was Margaret Chen, and her story made me want to put my fist through a wall. Margaret was 76 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who'd moved to Riverside Meadows 5 years ago after her husband died. She'd taught second grade for 42 years, shaped literally thousands of young lives, and spent her retirement gardening and volunteering at the local library. She was the kind of neighbor who baked cookies for new families moving in and organized holiday gift drives for families struggling financially. Margaret's backyard garden was her pride and joy. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, zucchini, green beans, herbs. She spent hours every week tending those plants, and she shared the harvest with neighbors who appreciated fresh vegetables. The garden had been there for 4 years without a single complaint. Then Carol drove past one day, spotted the vegetables through the fence line, and decided they were incompatible with her vision of Riverside Meadows. The violation notice claimed Margaret's garden violated aesthetic standards for residential landscaping because food crops weren't listed in the approved plant species appendix. When Margaret pointed out that food crops weren't prohibited either, Carol argued that anything not explicitly permitted was implicitly forbidden. When Margaret showed up at the next board meeting with support from a dozen neighbors who loved her vegetables, Carol tabled the discussion and then issued a new interpretation of the covenants that gave the Architectural Review Board absolute authority over all landscaping decisions. Margaret was ordered to remove all vegetable plants and replace them with ornamental flowers from the HOA's approved species list. Cost to comply: roughly $3,000 for plants, soil, and professional landscaping that the covenants required for any major landscape modification. Margaret lived on a teacher's pension that was already stretched thin by rising property taxes and homeowners insurance. $3,000 was 2 months of her total income. She couldn't afford it, couldn't afford a lawyer to fight it, and couldn't risk losing her home over a garden. She tore out the vegetables herself, working in 90-degree heat over 3 days because she couldn't afford to hire help. A neighbor found her passed out in her backyard from heat exhaustion and dehydration. The ambulance ride and emergency room visit cost Margaret another $1,800 after insurance. Carol sent a follow-up letter 2 weeks later, noting that Margaret had missed the compliance deadline and assessing a $500 late fee. When I talked to Margaret, she was sitting in her living room, surrounded by photos of her students, her late husband, and her grandchildren. She looked fragile, in a way that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with being systematically broken by someone who wielded petty power like a weapon. "I don't understand why she hates me," Margaret said softly. "I never did anything to her. I just wanted to grow tomatoes." These weren't isolated incidents. These were patterns. Carol Henderson had spent 6 years targeting anyone who couldn't fight back, anyone who showed weakness, anyone who dared to question her authority. She'd perfected the art of staying just barely within the technical boundaries of HOA authority while systematically destroying people's lives for profit and power. And the profit part was becoming clearer the more I investigated. Every family Carol targeted eventually faced a choice: comply with expensive repairs and modifications, or sell their house and leave. And whenever someone decided to sell, there was always a buyer waiting. A buyer represented by Riverside Development Group, the same company that had built the neighborhood. A buyer whose closing attorney always happened to be the same firm that represented Carol's husband's construction company. The houses got bought below market value from desperate families, got cosmetically updated by Henderson Construction Services, and got flipped back onto the market at a significant profit. Carol was running a systematic operation to force out vulnerable residents, acquire their properties cheap, and profit from the turnover. It was elegant, it was brutal, and it was about to become a federal case study in HOA corruption. Because while Carol had been building her empire of harassment and fear, I'd been building something too, a file thick enough to bury her and everyone connected to her operation. Every victim story, every violation notice, every pattern of discriminatory enforcement, every suspicious property transfer, all of it documented with the kind of thoroughness that 18 years of infrastructure management teaches you. Carol Henderson thought she was untouchable because she'd been getting away with it for 6 years. What she didn't understand was that corruption isn't invincible just because nobody's stopped you yet. It just means you haven't met the right person at the wrong time. And for Carol, I was definitely the wrong person at the wrong time. But before I could dismantle her empire, she needed to make one more mistake. One big enough, public enough, and stupid enough that even her construction company money and HOA authority couldn't protect her. That mistake was coming. I could feel it in every increasingly aggressive violation notice, every threatening letter, every sign that Carol was losing patience with my refusal to bow to her authority. When you've spent your entire life crushing people who can't fight back, you eventually forget that some people can. And when you finally meet one of them, your first instinct isn't caution. It's escalation. Carol's second violation notice arrived on a Friday afternoon, hand-delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. The envelope was thick, official, and carried the letterhead of Hawthorne and Sterling Legal Associates, a downtown firm that charged $400 an hour to help crush residents who stepped out of line. I signed for it at my front door, still wearing my work boots from the morning's emergency repair on a collapsed storm drain, and watched the process server practically sprint back to his car like he was escaping a crime scene. Smart man. He'd probably delivered enough of these legal threats to recognize when someone was about to become the center of an absolute disaster. The letter inside was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, 3 pages of dense text designed to make a normal person panic and comply immediately. But I wasn't a normal person, and after 18 years of reviewing municipal contracts, zoning disputes, and construction litigation, I could spot legal bullying from a mile away. NOTICEOFCOVENANTV IOLATIONSA and DDMA and DFO TAAE The heading was in bold, underlined, and size large enough to scream at you from the page. Subtle. The letter laid out my sins against the Riverside Meadows community with the gravity of war crimes. Unauthorized commercial vehicle storage in violation of Section 7.3 BE of the Covenants. Excessive noise disturbance in violation of Section 12.1 AA regarding community peace and quiet standards. Failure to obtain Architectural Review Board approval for vehicle-related structures, which apparently meant my truck in violation of Section 9.2 C, governing all exterior modifications or addition. That last one was particularly creative. Carol was classifying my truck as a structure requiring architectural approval, like it was a shed or a fence extension. The legal gymnastics required to make that argument would have been impressive if it weren't so transparently desperate. The financial demands came next, itemized with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. Initial violation fine, $500. Daily escalating penalty, $200 per day, beginning immediately. Legal fees for covenant enforcement, $1,200. Administrative processing fees, $300. Total amount due within 14 days, $2,000. Failure to comply would result in a lien being placed on my property, potential legal action seeking injunctive relief and additional damages, and referral to collections agencies that would destroy my credit rating and make my life a financial nightmare. The letter concluded with a paragraph that was clearly Carol's personal touch, dripping with a kind of passive-aggressive authority that she'd perfected over 6 years of terrorizing people. The Riverside Meadows HOA takes its responsibility to maintain community standards very seriously. Residents who cannot or will not comply with the covenants they agreed to upon purchase have demonstrated that they may be better suited to communities with less rigorous standards. We trust you will make the appropriate decision regarding your continued residence here. Translation: pay up, get rid of the truck, or we'll make your life so miserable you'll sell your house and leave. I sat at my kitchen table reading this legal fiction while my coffee cooled, and I did something Carol Henderson absolutely wasn't expecting. I laughed. Not polite laughter. The kind of deep, genuine amusement that comes from watching someone dig a hole so deep they'd need professional excavation equipment to escape. Because here's what Carol and her expensive lawyers had failed to investigate before sending this threat. The truck they wanted removed wasn't mine. It never had been. That Ford F-450 sitting in my driveway was owned by the city of Riverside, assigned to my position as Senior Municipal Infrastructure Manager, and protected by governmental immunity that made HOA covenants about as legally relevant as a fortune cookie. Under Iowa law and similar statutes in most states, government vehicles being used for official duties are exempt from local regulations, including HOA covenants. The legal theory is simple. HOAs are private organizations with authority derived from property contracts, but they can't interfere with governmental operations that serve the broader public interest. When those two authorities conflict, government wins every single time. Carol's lawyers should have caught this. A competent legal team would have asked basic questions like who owns this vehicle and what is it being used for, before threatening a city employee with financial ruin. But Carol had probably told them what she wanted done, and they'd apparently just rubber-stamped her vendetta without doing actual due diligence. That kind of legal malpractice was about to cost them dearly. I pulled out my phone and called Rachel Torres, the senior city attorney, who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of case to land on her desk. Rachel, they just threatened to put a lion on my house for parking city property. There was a pause, then the sound of Rachel's coffee mug hitting her desk hard enough that I heard it through the phone. David, please tell me you're not joking. Please tell me they actually put that threat in writing. 3 pages of it, signed by their lawyers at Hawthorne and Sterling. Oh, this is Christmas morning. Email me that letter immediately. I'm calling an emergency meeting with the city manager, and we're about to teach this HOA what governmental immunity actually means. While Rachel started building the city's response, I made my second call to someone who'd been tracking HOA corruption cases across the region, James Chen, an investigative reporter for the Riverside Tribune who'd won awards for exposing municipal corruption and predatory lending schemes. James, remember when you told me to call if I ever had a story about HOA overreach that was too good to be true? I've got one that's going to blow your mind. We met at a coffee shop downtown 2 hours later, and I walked James through everything: Carol's 6-year reign of terror, the pattern of targeting vulnerable residents, the suspicious property transfers to companies connected to her husband's construction business, and now the threat to fine a city employee for parking a city vehicle while performing city duties. James pulled out his recorder with hands that actually shook with excitement. David, this isn't just an HOA overreach story. This is systematic corruption with a racial discrimination angle and potential bid rigging that crosses into criminal territory. How fast can you get me interviews with the other residents she's targeted? I can have you talking to Teresa Walsh, Marcus Johnson, and Margaret Chen by tomorrow afternoon. They've been waiting years for someone to actually listen. And you're sure about the governmental immunity angle? That's the hook that makes this story go from local interest to statewide coverage. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of the truck's registration. City of Riverside, Municipal Fleet Services, assigned to David Patterson, Senior Infrastructure Manager. That truck has responded to 14 emergency calls in the past 3 months. Water main breaks, sewer backups, storm damage assessment. Every time Carol sees it in my driveway, it's because I've been working to keep this city's infrastructure from collapsing, and she wants to fine me for it. James leaned back in his chair, and I could practically see the headline forming in his head. How does Tuesday front page sound? That gives me time to interview your neighbors, get comment from Carol and her lawyers, and file public records requests for all the property transfers you mentioned. Tuesday's perfect. That's exactly 14 days from when I received the violation notice, which means Carol will be expecting either payment or compliance. What she's going to get instead is a front-page story and a legal response from the city that's going to make her lawyers soil their expensive suits. While James started building his investigative piece, I spent the weekend documenting everything with the kind of thoroughness that drives my coworkers crazy but makes lawyers weep with joy. I pulled property records showing every house that had sold under distress in Riverside Meadows over the past 6 years. 23 properties, all following the same pattern: elderly or minority homeowners, escalating HOA violations, eventual sale to buyers represented by the same real estate group, cosmetic updates by Henderson Construction Services, and resale at 20 to 30% markup. The profit on those flips totaled over $2 million across 6 years. Carol and her husband weren't just running an HOA. They were running a systematic property acquisition scheme that used covenant enforcement as a weapon to force distressed sales, then profited from the turnover. I documented the pattern of discriminatory enforcement that Marcus Johnson had tracked. White families with identical violations either never got cited or received warning letters that mysteriously disappeared after a friendly conversation. The Johnson family, the only black family in the neighborhood, had received 37 formal violation notices in 2 years, each one carefully documented with photos, measurements, and legal citations that seemed designed more to intimidate than to correct actual problems. I pulled utility records, which I had access to through my city position, showing that Carol's house had water usage patterns consistent with filling a swimming pool during a severe drought when the city had mandatory restrictions in place. She'd never been cited for water waste, never received a warning, and apparently the rules she loved enforcing on everyone else didn't apply to her own property. And I documented every piece of communication I'd had with Carol: her initial threat at my doorstep, her follow-up phone calls that became increasingly aggressive, her violation notices that escalated from warnings to fines, and finally, this legal threat from her attorneys demanding $2,000 and threatening my property with a lion. By Sunday evening, I had a file that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy: evidence of systematic corruption, discriminatory enforcement, property fraud, and now interference with governmental operations. All documented, cross-referenced, and ready to destroy Carol Henderson's little empire. Monday morning, Rachel Torres called with an update that made my entire week. David, the city manager, is furious. And when I say furious, I mean she's already scheduled a meeting with Hawthorne and Sterling to explain exactly how badly they screwed up. We're drafting a formal response that's going to cite governmental immunity, demand withdrawal of all threats, and put Carol Henderson on notice that if she continues to harass a city employee performing official duties, we'll pursue legal action against both her and the HOA. What kind of legal action? The fun kind: interference with governmental functions, harassment of a public employee, abuse of private covenant authority. We're also going to recommend that the county prosecutor look at the property transfer patterns you documented, because if even half of what you've shown me is accurate, there's a prima facie case for real estate fraud and possibly criminal conspiracy. Tuesday morning arrived with the Riverside Tribune's front page carrying a headline that would permanently alter Carol Henderson's life.